Welcome, everyone, to our deep dive today. And today we're going to be taking on a pretty fascinating
Yes.
and sometimes misunderstood section of the Bible, Romans chapters 9 through 11.
That's right.
So we've got like a whole stack of stuff here. We've got articles, research notes, even a little snippet from another podcast, all talking about, God's plan for Israel and ultimately for everyone. What really makes this section so compelling to me, though, is that it's intensely personal. So you have Paul, the author of Romans, expressing this really profound love for his fellow Jewish people. He even says that he would be willing to be cut off from Christ himself
Wow.
if it meant that they would be saved.
Yeah.
Talk about a powerful starting point for a deep dive.
Oh, absolutely. It really
Yes.
does set the stage for these chapters. We're getting this kind of panoramic view
Wow.
of history, of theology, of everything. Talking about God's choice of Israel, the role of faith, and ultimately just this incredibly beautiful vision of inclusion. It's a lot to unpack.
It is a lot to unpack, and I think that's why we're splitting this one up into 3 different parts for this deep dive.
Good idea.
Okay, so let's unpack it. Starting with chapter 9.
Okay.
So Paul's anguish for his people, it's so palpable in this chapter. He says, and I quote, "For I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ,
Wow.
for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen according to the flesh." That is some serious anguish right there.
It really is.
It makes you wonder, what's behind such intense emotion?
I think that's the heart of it, isn't it? It's not just an intellectual argument. This is deeply personal for Paul, and it really leads into this massive theological point. God's choice of Israel. It wasn't based on them earning it. It was purely out of mercy, Romans 9.16. It even says, so then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy.
Yeah. So that mercy being the foundation, it really challenges, our very human ideas of deservingness.
Doesn't it?
Doesn't it? It's like saying worthiness in God's eyes isn't about what you've achieved. It's about something so much bigger than that.
It really does disrupt our whole system of thinking.
Yeah.
We tend to think in terms of I did this, so I deserve this. But here it's not about earning God's favor. It's about his radical, undeserved love.
But if that's the case, and God chose Israel, why are so many rejecting Jesus? That seems like a contradiction.
Yeah, and that's the tension that drives the rest of these chapters. It's God's sovereignty, his choice, bumping up against the very human reality of free will. We have the choice to accept or reject that grace.
So then how does Romans 10 fit into all of this? Because it seems like there's a shift, right? Paul moves from this broad historical view into something a little bit more personal.
Yeah, you're picking up on a crucial transition here. So in Romans 10, the focus shifts to individual responsibility, specifically the importance of faith in Jesus for salvation.
Okay, so it's like Paul saying, okay, here's the crux of it. Regardless of where you come from. And he really drives this point home in Romans 10.9, where he says, because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved.
And the beauty of that message is its inclusivity.
Yeah.
Right? Like salvation isn't about rituals or your family tree. It's about this personal relationship with Christ. That's open to everyone.
I'm seeing how this connects back to Paul's anguish for his people. He so desperately wants them to have that personal relationship, that salvation. But then he asks, how can they believe in someone that they haven't even heard of?
That's right.
It's a valid question.
Oh, absolutely. He says in Romans 10.14, how then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching?
Yeah.
That's where we come in.
Yeah.
You and me, every believer. We're tasked with sharing the gospel.
It's like that image of the runner racing to deliver like this urgent news to a city, like that sense of responsibility. That's what sharing our faith should feel like.
Precisely. And that brings us to Romans 11, where things take another turn.
Oh, yeah, because now, after all this, the question becomes, did God just give up on Israel entirely?
And the answer is a resounding no. Romans 11.1 starts with, I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means.
Whoa, that is a powerful statement. But how can that be, after everything that's been said?
Well, one of the sources that we've got here uses this example of Elijah. He felt like he was the only one left faithful to God, utterly alone. But then God reveals that there's this whole hidden remnant of believers.
I'm starting to see how much we miss when we only look at the surface of things. There's always more to the story.
Oh, there's always more. And then to illustrate this even further, Paul introduces this incredibly vivid analogy of the olive tree. So Israel is the original tree, and Gentile believers like us, We're branches grafted in.
Ooh, I'm already so intrigued. What does that imagery even mean for us today, practically speaking?
Well, the first thing it should do is humble us. We were outside of God's covenant promises, and now we're included purely by his grace. We're part of the same tree, drawing life from the same source. And the source we read really emphasized this point. We can't afford to get arrogant about it.
Yeah, that's a good place to stop for today.
Okay.
But we'll pick this up next time on part 2 of this deep dive on Romans 9 through 11. Yeah, that point about humility really struck me too. It's easy to get caught up in the us versus them, especially when you're talking about, God's chosen people. But this olive tree analogy, it just dismantles those barriers.
Yeah, it's such a powerful visual, isn't it? It reminds us that God's family isn't about ethnicity or lineage. It's about faith. And that family is diverse, it's messy, it's full of contradictions, but it's united in Christ, all drawing life from the same source.
It really challenges you to think differently about the whole concept of chosenness.
It's not about exclusivity. It's about God's love and grace, extending to everyone, regardless of background. And that brings us back to that crucial role we play in sharing that message. It's not a passive waiting game. We're called to be active participants, just like Paul was, in spreading the gospel.
So it's interesting because on one hand, we're called to be humble, recognizing that we're grafted in, not the original branch.
Right.
But on the other hand, we're called to be bold in sharing our faith. How do you balance those two?
That's a great question. I think it's about walking that fine line, recognizing our own place in the story, but also the urgency of the message we carry. Remember that runner racing to deliver the news? We can't let fear or self-doubt hold us back from sharing this incredible truth.
So taking a step back for a moment, why should someone listening to this care about these ancient chapters from Romans? How does it apply to their life today?
That's a fair question. And I think the answer lies in those timeless truths that these chapters reveal about God, about humanity, about our place in the world. Look around. We're still dealing with the same issues that Paul was wrestling with. Division, pride, the struggle to understand God's plan. Romans speaks directly to those issues.
Give us an example. How does it connect to our everyday lives?
Well, think about the conflicts that we see all around us, political, racial, religious. So much of it stems from this us versus them mentality. And Romans challenges that at its very core. It dismantles those barriers by proclaiming that in Christ, we are one.
So it's not just this abstract theological concept. It has real-world implications.
Absolutely. These chapters give us a framework for understanding our own identity, our relationships with others, and ultimately our purpose in the world.
It's like an antidote to the negativity and division that's so pervasive today.
Precisely. And it also speaks to those wrestling with questions of faith and doubt. If God is so good, why is there suffering? Why do bad things happen? Romans doesn't give easy answers to those questions, but it offers something much more profound, a deep sense of comfort and reassurance.
How so?
Well, remember Paul's own anguish for his people. He doesn't shy away from the pain and complexity of the situation, but even in his grief, he clings to the truth of God's sovereignty and faithfulness. He trusts that God is working all things together for good, even when it doesn't make sense to us.
So it's about holding on to hope, even in the midst of difficulty.
Exactly, and remembering that God's plans are often far grander and more intricate than we can grasp. We catch glimpses, but we don't have a full picture.
That's really resonating with me. It's like we can trust that there's a bigger story unfolding, even when things feel chaotic.
Yes, and that's where the doxology in Romans 11 comes in.
Yeah.
It's this beautiful eruption of praise right in the middle of this complex theological argument.
It's like Paul's saying, mic drop, God's got this. But I'm curious, what's the significance of the doxology in this context, it seems like? More than just a random burst of praise.
You're right, it's not random at all. The doxology actually serves a very specific purpose by erupting into praise. Paul highlights the paradoxical wisdom of God's plan, a plan that often looks like folly to human eyes. It's a powerful reminder that even when we don't understand, we can still trust in God's ultimate goodness and wisdom.
That's fascinating. It gives a whole new layer of meaning to that passage.
And it reinforces the point we were making earlier. Even amidst the complexity and mystery of God's plan, there's always reason to celebrate His wisdom, His power, and His love.
It's like a breath of fresh air in the middle of a dense forest.
Exactly. And it leaves us with this sense of wonder, this desire to explore further.
Speaking of exploring further, there was one more thing in our sources that caught my eye. It was about how. Our understanding of God's plan for Israel and the church should actually impact our actions in the world today. It's like, okay, we've explored these concepts, but what do we do with this knowledge?
That's where the rubber meets the road, isn't it? It's not enough to just understand these concepts intellectually. We need to let them shape how we live, how we interact with the world around us.
So how does that actually play out? What are we supposed to do differently?
Well, first and foremost, it should cultivate humility in us. Remember how Paul warned against Gentile believers becoming arrogant? We're grafted into the olive tree by grace, not by our own merit. That should keep us grounded.
So it's a constant reminder to check our pride at the door.
Exactly. And it should also fuel a desire to share the gospel with even more passion and urgency, knowing that God's heart is for all people. That should motivate us to reach out to those who haven't yet heard this incredible good news.
Like that runner we talked about, bringing vital news to a waiting city. We have a responsibility.
Yes.
To share this message.
Precisely. And it's not just about words. It's about living in a way that reflects God's love and grace. It's about being agents of reconciliation in a world that's so fractured and divided.
I love that phrase, agents of reconciliation. It's so powerful, and it feels so relevant.
It is incredibly relevant in today's world, and it's a call to action for every believer. Romans 9-11 challenges us to move beyond our comfort zones, to engage with those who are different from us, and to be a force for positive change in the world.
That's a tall order, but an inspiring one, too. It makes me think about that question that one of our sources posed. If God's plan is so grand and inclusive, how does that impact our understanding of the world today and our role in it? Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And it's a question we can't answer in a single deep dive, but it's a question that should linger in our minds and hearts, shaping our thoughts and actions.
So true. It's like a seed that's been planted, and now it's up to us to nurture it and let it grow.
Right. Beautifully said. And as we conclude this deep dive, I want to encourage our listeners to revisit these chapters of Romans for themselves. There's so much depth and richness to explore, and each time you read them, you'll likely discover something new.
It's amazing, isn't it, how these ancient texts can still speak so directly to our lives today. You know, we've been talking about God's grand plan, the olive tree analogy, the call to be agents of reconciliation. But there's one piece from our sources that I want to make sure that we hit.
Okay.
And it's about the phrase, all Israel will be saved. Powerful statement. But honestly, it's a little confusing.
Yeah.
What does Paul even mean by that?
Yeah, that's one of those verses that has sparked a lot of debate.
Yeah.
And interpretation over the centuries.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be a proper deep dive if we didn't at least touch on the complexity of it.
Okay, so let's wade into those deep waters. What are some of the main interpretations of this phrase?
Well, one view is that it refers to a future, literal salvation of every Jewish person. This interpretation often ties into end times theology and the idea of a mass conversion before the return of Christ.
So like a specific moment in time when all Jewish people will come to faith.
Exactly. But then there's another interpretation, which focuses more on the spiritual aspect of salvation. So this view sees Israel as representing those who are truly God's people, both Jew and Gentile, based on faith in Christ.
So it's not so much about ethnicity, but about who's part of God's spiritual family.
Right, and this interpretation often points to the idea of a remnant, that throughout history there's always been a faithful group within Israel who have followed God, and that this faithfulness will continue, ultimately culminating in a complete and final salvation.
So two very different ways of understanding that phrase, both with significant implications.
Absolutely, and it's important to note that within each of those broad interpretations, there are nuances and variations as well. It's a rich and complex theological discussion.
That's why I love these deep dives. You get to really wrestle with these challenging ideas and explore different perspectives.
I agree.
But for someone listening to this, trying to make sense of it all, what's the key takeaway here?
Well, I think the key takeaway is the unwavering faithfulness of God. Regardless of how you interpret that specific phrase, the overarching message of Romans 9-11 is one of hope and promise. God hasn't abandoned his plan, and his love and grace extend to all who believe.
Yeah, it's a good reminder, especially when we look around at the world and all the chaos and division.
Absolutely, it's a beacon of hope, an anchor for our souls.
Speaking of hope, one of our sources ended with this thought-provoking question. If God's plan is so grand and inclusive, how does that impact our understanding of the world today and our role in it?
It's a big question.
The one worth pondering.
It absolutely is. And it's a question we each have to grapple with, individually and collectively. How do we live out this grand, inclusive vision in our everyday lives? How do we become agents of reconciliation in a world so desperately in need of healing.
It's a challenge, for sure, but it's also an incredible opportunity.
I couldn't agree more. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey through these complex and powerful chapters.
It has, and we've barely scratched the surface. There's so much more to discover in Romans 9 through 11. So to everyone listening, I encourage you, keep digging, keep exploring, keep wrestling with these ideas.
And don't forget to share your own insights and questions. With our online community, we'd love to hear what you're learning and how these chapters are speaking to you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, keep diving deep